What's going on, fam? Today we're talking about Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, aka TSM or TSMC. This is the Wealth Investing Network. We do this for the win. We're seeing this particular stock up over 10% on the day, crossing over a $400 billion market cap, and they've still got a nice dividend yield above 2%. We're talking about it because the news on the day is that Warren Buffett's company, Berkshire Hathaway, bought a $4.1 billion stake in the company. But before we get into it, I have to ask you to please leave a like on this video. Please subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. Now, moving on. If you're unfamiliar, TSMC has some of the largest chip foundries on the planet. I mean, it's really one of the biggest companies when you consider this space. They pump out so many computer chips that go into all kind of devices. We're not just talking about PCs and phones. We're talking about a little bit of everything. There are so many things that have semiconductor chips that you wouldn't even think of. And while TSMC does design some of their own chips, really a lot of other companies come to TSMC having already designed their chips, and they're just looking for the manufacturing. Because especially for companies in the US, they don't want to manufacture their own chips because it's expensive, essentially. And it might just be cheaper for TSM to do it. And they have the capacity for it. They have the space for it. They have the expertise. I would say a rival, Intel, is trying to really boost up their manufacturing. But besides that, and maybe Samsung, no one really comes close in that regard to be able to pump out chips on the scale that needs to be done to satisfy the needs of Apple, Qualcomm, Broadcom, Nvidia, AMD, and a myriad of other companies that you can think of. But while the stock is up 10% on the day, you take a look at the last 6 months, you take a look at the last year, the stock it hasn't been doing so well. And there's been somewhat of a slowdown in chips. 2020 was a big boom and a spike in that regard, and it's gone down. Back in the spring and summer, a lot of reports were showing that Nvidia, AMD, and Apple were trying to lower their chip orders. There were a lot of reports about lower demand for electronics, the GPUs related to crypto, PCs, and laptops. There's also some concern about tensions with Taiwan and China, and obviously that could pose some serious challenges for the chip industry because if a lot of companies are designing their chips maybe in the United States, but having them manufactured in Taiwan, well, if there's any kind of barrier in terms of people actually getting the semiconductor chips and actually being able to buy the phones and laptops. And we saw how supply chain issues affected the car market, especially with electric cars. Ford and GM talking about that in their earnings reports. Again, this could pose some serious challenges if there's any kind of conflict. And so a strategy might be to not put all your eggs in one basket. Apple was considering shifting some things over to Japan. I heard there were some talks about shifting some things over to India as well. In the US, President Biden recently had a meeting with the leader of China discussing kind of the one China policy that everyone kind of accepts but doesn't quite agree with. So I just wanted to give you some backstory there because a lot of things that happen in the market relate to fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and not actually what's going on with the numbers at TSM. And perhaps Warren Buffett is someone who understands that. If you're unfamiliar, Warren Buffett is essentially a billionaire. He runs this company, Berkshire Hathaway. That would be this company right here that has a portfolio of companies. They own Apple, a lot of oil companies, insurance companies, but really kind of a broad range of things. Coca-Cola, by the way. So a lot of different companies, pretty diverse. And so with this, of course, being a big public company, they recently had to disclose some of the big buying that they've been doing lately. And they mentioned, oh, by the way, we purchased $4.1 billion in Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. It's of note that these are American depository shares because TSM is not listed on the NASDAQ, let's say. So again, there's always some risk with these kinds of things. But speaking of risk, as I was doing my research, I learned something that Berkshire Hathaway, and this is based on Q2, has about 894 million shares in Apple. What does that mean? Well, they have a $300 billion portfolio. That's huge. But approximately 40% of that is Apple. He is very, very bullish on Apple and has taken steps to buy more and more of it, clearly. The only other stakeholder that owns more of Apple is the Vanguard Group. So I think this is very interesting to note. And I see the logic. If you're bullish on Apple and you think they have pricing power over the American consumer, and you see a company like TSMC that has maybe some pricing power over Apple, or at least somehow they're able to make good margins with their partnership with Apple, then logically TSM could be a good investment as well. Maybe in a separate video, I can track how he's been buying over time. But again, when it comes to risk, I'm not the kind of person that's just going to go and copy his portfolio just because he's a billionaire. But I do think TSM is an interesting company. I have a very, very tiny bit of my portfolio in TSM as well. I bought some all the way back in 2020. And so would I consider buying more? Well, we'll see. I do think it's interesting that Warren Buffett is getting into this. This is a company that almost had a $600 billion market cap. We talk about the market cap a lot. It's basically what the market thinks the company is valued at any given point in time, and that can change very quickly. As you can see, within 9 months, it went from being an almost $600 billion company to about a $350 billion company. And what all really changed about the stock and about the numbers, about the revenue? Well, actually, they've been growing their revenue. They've been doing pretty well, growing their balance sheet, increasing their cash position, things of that nature. But a lot of times it's that FUD, that fear, uncertainty, and doubt that can bring a stock down. And of course, I'm in Yahoo Finance here, and these numbers need to be updated. And you got to watch out with this in general because TSM does report their numbers in the local currency, which could confuse you if you look at their revenue and see $2 trillion, or you might think they actually have $1.5 trillion on their balance sheet. No, they're not exactly dollars. So always beware of that kind of thing when you're doing your own research. I'm not trying to give you financial advice here. I highly recommend you go and look at their balance sheet in their income statements and things of that nature. As you can see, they express their results in millions of new Taiwan dollars. NDT would be the acronym for that, not USD. So that's something to keep in mind. They do have a little section for USD here just because there's a high interest in it, but they do keep most of their numbers in local. And while sometimes I'll really nerd out and go line by line into these companies' earnings, but to keep things short today for you, I'm only going to focus on the most important numbers. I'm going to show you my full breakdown here. I even throw in 2 companies that are competitors / rivals to TSMC, Intel and AMD, or Advanced Micro Devices, because those are interesting, 2 very similar market caps. But again, with TSMC, we're talking about a $420 billion company roughly at the moment after the recent spike we've had. And the most important numbers here are the total revenue in the last 12 months and the revenue growth. Now, we know environments can change quickly, but at this pace, Taiwan Semi is one of the largest semiconductor companies out there by revenue, and they're growing at a pace where they'll essentially double every 2 to 3 years if we're being generous. And might I add, they're doing it at a net income margin of 43%. I mentioned do your own research. Go look up the net income margins of Google, Apple, or any company that you think is really good, Microsoft, any of those, and they're not able to keep up with this kind of pace. As you can see, a larger company by revenue was not able to sustain that revenue growth, and they're actually in a decline, and they don't have nearly the margin that Taiwan Semiconductor has. So what you would want to see from TSMC moving forward is for them to maintain this high margin and for them to eventually grow their cash position. And that means they would be able to do things like stock buybacks, pay a higher dividend, things of that nature, or invest more back into their business. Intel's at that phase right now. AMD is not quite yet at that phase, but this is a very popular stock, a highly valued stock. You see that PE ratio at 44, while the average for tech companies is somewhere between 17 and 20 something. So this is a very above average PE ratio. People are very excited about this company, but they don't have nearly the revenue. And while 29% revenue growth is great, it still doesn't stack up to TSMC. They are very good at making profits and returning them to shareholders. But the reason why this company is probably a little undervalued from that perspective is the risks, like I talked about before. Is that a risk that I think a lot of investors are going to be willing to take? I think yes. I'm also invested in this. Would I nibble a little more here? I do think I'm going to wait because this isn't the first stock that Warren Buffett has bought. The market gets excited about it and then he sells it. I'm not really going to get into it, but go look up BYD, a car maker in China, mostly electric cars. But because TSM is a little more well-known, I would say it's a little different. We're going to take a look at it from a technical chart perspective. The black line is the 200-day moving average. I like to look at this because it's kind of a medium to long-term trend. And I like to kind of say when it's up, the trend is your friend. When it's down, not so much. You can see there's been a steep downtrend for pretty much the entire year. And the spike in the last couple of days is making it almost touch that 200-day moving average. This is the kind of view that I like to look at. And I'm going to draw a line from the peak that it reached back at the beginning of the year. And I'm going to draw it all the way through to that peak they reached in August. And you can see there's a little hitch in pretty much the very moment where they've broken out of their trend to an extent. You could probably also draw another line showing a downward channel in this stock, and you could make a case that it's broken out of this channel and is ready to do something different. And usually places where it's found support, right, places where it's stopped going down and started going back up, usually those places would be areas of resistance going back up. That's the tough part about getting into a stock that's been on a downtrend for this amount of time. Because, right, imagine if you had bought TSM at $100, you'd still be down on your position today. The spike would be nice, but you're probably waiting for it to get back up to $100 for you to sell. Just a hypothetical. So while there's some excitement now, I would be a little bit patient on this one. Hindsight's 2020, and you don't get the Buffett bump, right? The stock's up 20% this week, and really he's the one that's going to benefit from that the most. And while there still might be some opportunity for us little guys, I do think, once again, the billionaire is going to be the big winner on the day. I'm going to wait for the next rate hike to pass, maybe the next one after that, a couple of earnings reports from TSMC, any signs of headwinds or tailwinds in the semiconductor space. Those are the kinds of things I'm going to look out for. But while TSMC is already in my portfolio, it's also going to move a little higher on my watch list, something I'm going to be looking at a little more closely. Thank you so much for watching. If you stuck around this long in the video, I tell you a secret, and today it's that I'm about to go to the back of the freezer and get the ice cream that my wife doesn't know about. I'd really appreciate if you'd also hit that like button. Again, thank you so much for watching. See you in the next video.